Hello, everyone, and welcome to Columbia Business School Executive Education. We are happy to bring you this webinar today, Art of Conflict, which I can guarantee you will be an interesting and enlightening conversation. Just one quick thing before we start. If you have any questions or comments as the webinar is going along, please feel free to type them into the chat box, and we will see how many questions and comments we can address. My name is Mary Schiller, and I am with Columbia Business School Executive Education, and I'm joined today by Professor Grant Ackerman, who will be helping us with the art of conflict. Professor Ackerman is a member of the executive faculty and the faculty director of our program called Columbia Essentials of Management. Columbia Essentials of Management has two sessions coming up. One starts June 7th, and the other in the fall starts on November 1st. Professor Ackerman also previously served as the academic director and associate dean for Exec Ed. So I'd like to welcome Professor Ackerman.
Thank you, Mary. Delighted to be with you as always.
Great. Thanks, Grant. So let's start with sort of a basic question about the art of conflict. How much conflict is actually good for an organization?
Very good. Well, in fact, there is a relationship between conflict and performance in organizations, and it cuts both ways. Without enough conflict, an organization oftentimes isn't optimizing their performance, and you can see how that might be the case, particularly if you're in the midst of a creative endeavor and everybody is just agreeing. It's likely that you're not getting the best ideas on the table, and there's different reasons why people would be unwilling to be in conflict. We can talk more about that, but here's the key. Too much conflict can actually hinder performance, and so it's a fine line. It's a very important journey to have just enough conflict, that you're getting ideas out, that people can disagree constructively, but you want to make sure that it doesn't get into unhealthy conflict that not only is not constructive, but actually can be destructive to the organization. Now, what is that fine line, you might ask? Well, it's the art, not the science. You have to have a certain sense of yourself, a sense of others, and with that then know exactly when it's time to literally create more conflict and when it's time to tone it down a bit and try to get people back on the same page and building a consensus on key issues.
Let's talk a little bit more about that fine line, if you will. I think that's the one we're all interested in. Is there a way to sort of tell when let's start with this, when there isn't enough conflict? Are there kind of symptoms?
Well, that's important. In fact, there's a great quote that says, when everybody's agreeing, somebody's not thinking. And so when you have too much consensus, when everybody agrees, particularly at the outset of a project, when you really want to be maximizing ideas and creative processes, and everyone is just kind of rushing to the solution, and everybody agrees with it, that's the moment when you want to step back and say, what did we miss? What are we not thinking about? What's outside our radar screen even that we need to revisit it? So it's a bit of a normative moment, and I want to emphasize that. It really depends on not only the individual but the organization's comfort level with conflict, and there has to be a comfort level that suggests that when you're in the midst of that agreement, it's okay for somebody to say, wait a minute, let's think a little bit more about this. So that's the trigger point to say, let's mix it up a bit, and hopefully there's permission to do that in the team or in the organization.
And then, I mean, maybe this seems kind of obvious, but what maybe there are underlying signs of when there's too much conflict in an organization? Right. What can that look like?
Right. Well, a key telltale sign is communication breaks down. So when you get to a moment where folks are not communicating openly either at the meeting or in the organization generally, And it's because there's the sense that folks are in conflict and they're not able to get beyond it. That's when you know it's really beginning to spiral out of control, and you want to address that. That's one thing. Now, the other is also evident when there's heated discussions, although I would caution that just because conversation is animated and folks are getting passionate, that doesn't mean that the conflict's getting out of control. In fact, if anything, that might mean that you're well on your way to some very creative processes. But whenever it becomes such a heated discussion that people aren't listening to each other, they're not receiving what the other has to say in a constructive way. Worst moment is when it becomes personal, when heated discussions begin to border on a test of wills rather than trying to find solutions in a passionate way. That's when you know that, and again, you want to have your antennas up. You want to be listening carefully. You want to see that it may be time for a break, just for everybody to step aside and think about it a little bit more, or an intervention to actually address that conflict. And if it's on the personal side, try to air it out. And if it's on the substantive side, try to engage in some constructive conversations to figure out how to get everybody back agreeing and moving forward together.
We have some interesting questions coming in here, so I will interject those because they relate to what we were just talking about. Is there some kind of etiquette for constructive conflict, a way to, have that creative conversation, let's say, so it doesn't end up getting too heated, or at least trying not to let it?
That's a great word, etiquette, and we can think of it in terms of, is there a protocol? Is there a process? And I'd encourage that there is, and it's plural, there are techniques and approaches that you can create that become the norm for your meetings and for your organization. And some of them are elemental but often forgotten, particularly when you want to have the conflict escalate. And so turn-taking would be one. You know that you're getting into trouble when folks are speaking over each other. Fighting for the microphone is one way to think about it. And at that point, again, it can be born of good intentions and passion, but if the information's not coming out, if people are getting cut off, that's not good. And so one moment of etiquette is making sure that there's turn-taking, that not one person dominates the conversation. And it's a great topic. We can go deeper into it because sometimes folks aren't speaking up in a group or a meeting situation, and it's not because they don't have something to say. It's because they're not going to fight for the microphone. So corollary to the turn-taking etiquette is inviting people to comment. And so if it's clear that some folks have not made a contribution and they've been invited to the meeting, that means that they are an integral part of this project. Whoever is chairing the meeting ought to make sure that they invite in folks who haven't commented yet to give them that opportunity, because everybody has a different approach on that.
Do you think it's
so that's one. I could go on with others, but hopefully that was helpful.
Yes, very. And along those lines, do you think it's ever helpful to bring in an observer to sort of watch how a group is communicating and managing potential conflict?
It really is helpful, and I'll tell you why, and I'll tell you how it can be used. One, the immediate introduction of observer puts everybody on good behavior. Talk about introducing then a sense of etiquette, because when you have an observer in the room, when you have company, if you will, folks are just more mindful of themselves and mindful of the dynamics. I've actually used that technique when there have been groups that have gotten themselves in trouble. And so by observing, not only are they on their good behavior, but it can be a great diagnostic in terms of what people may be doing without intending, but it's having a negative consequence. There's also a normative moment. That's I'd put in the category of an intervention, somebody who's coming in to observe because there's a challenge. I think the best approach to creating a culture in an organization that welcomes conflict in a constructive way is to create the norm where you can have folks come in to observe, and it's not an intervention. It's such a natural part of what you do. and you can get feedback from them. Doesn't mean that the group's not functional. It just means the group wants to improve their performance. And so having an observer come in gives the opportunity for some great feedback about how the group is doing and how they can improve performance. So that's, the key is an observer brings to mind a sense of self-awareness, self-management, and empathy for others. And to the extent the observer helps introduce those ideas, that's terrific. Hopefully, in the course of time, they become a very natural part of the group and the individual dynamic.
Thank you, Grant. That was really interesting. We have quite a few comments coming in that sort of relate to one area, so I'm hoping that you can address it. It has to do with kind of a power struggle, depending on where people are in the organization, that if there's conflict, it can come across as if you're not aligned with leadership, when in fact maybe you're just trying to share what you feel is a helpful, idea or solution to something. Can you talk a little bit about how conflict works in terms of people's position within an organization?
And in fact, that concept of power, I call it the P word, the word that folks don't necessarily want to address up front, is a critical ingredient to any organization, any team, and certainly in the context of team meetings and conflict. So let me try to pick it apart a bit because power is such a general concept. First of all, we're talking about power. We can first talk about power in relationship to authority in the organization, so the formal lines of authority. And there may be very specific norms depending on the corporate culture, depending on the country culture, about who can speak up when. And my first encouragement is to be mindful of those norms. If it's inappropriate for somebody who is not in a senior position to immediately talk during a meeting or talk before being called upon, you can try to interject your ideas, but if the cultural norm is such that it's inappropriate, it's likely then going to sabotage the content of what you're about to say. So one, be aware of the norms, but that raises a critical question about leadership, particularly in a contemporary environment, because leadership now has to find that balance between being decisive, making decisions, giving instructions, and having people execute. That's an essential component of leadership. And yet at the same time, because of the complexity of the world that we live in, the communications and information that overwhelm us, it really leadership requires inviting in others and other thoughts. And so a strong leader is going to have a capacity to invite others to contribute, not worried that it is a challenge to their power. They're going to invite comment. Now that's an art also, simply because a strong leader is inviting others to comment doesn't mean that those others have final outcome control, meaning they don't necessarily get to make the final decision. They're simply advising, they're giving information, they're giving insights. And that can be difficult because a strong leader may feel that as soon as they ask people's opinion or invite an open discussion, they've lost power. I don't think that has to be the case. I think they can make it very clear that we're open to ideas, open to suggestions, and then they still reserve the right to make the final decision. And I think there's a reciprocity there too. Individuals who want to contribute, who perhaps are not in that power position, in addition to understanding the normative moments about when it's appropriate to comment, I think they also want to introduce the idea or introduce their ideas in a way that's respectful, whatever appropriate in that particular corporation or culture. So the process by which they introduce their ideas is as critical as the fact that they're introducing their ideas themselves. So being appropriate in that moment to introduce the ideas, and then also recognizing that simply because you were given the voice doesn't mean that you're going to have your way, that you were able to contribute, give your ideas. If a decision is taken that's an opposite to what you were suggesting, count it a win because you had the opportunity to contribute. And my hope is that particularly leaders in contemporary organizations are thankful for the individual that is willing to speak up. The worst case scenario, and this happens all too often in organizations, is when a group or a leader is moving in a particular direction and someone in that group knows that it's just going to be a problem. There's a glitch, there is a challenge that others aren't seeing. They know it, but they're not saying anything. They're willing to allow the group consensus to move forward. They feel uncomfortable raising the issue. And then as a result, what they feared actually comes true, and the project is compromised. Well, a strong leader would hope that if they have individuals in a group that actually has that insight about what the problems are, that those individuals are going to be willing to speak up. So it is a bit of an art. It is a bit of a negotiated reality in terms of who gets to contribute when.
Mm-hmm. One of the things that came to mind, and somebody else posted this too as you were talking, was that this, I would call it a culture of conflict, but also a culture of learning that sounds like needs to be created to make conflict a healthy part of an organization, basically. And so if you aren't in a leadership role, is there any way that you can sort of start to bring this in?
Well, in fact, that culture of learning as a complement to a culture of constructive conflict is perfect. And in fact, that's the whole, not the whole idea, but part of the idea with having constructive conflict is that you are learning together in real time and then learning about what has occurred so that you can improve the organization. So that is a fundamental element. I think it's terrific, that idea of the purpose of conflict is to enhance our learning experience. And I think, one, that's the way to begin to introduce it into the group, into the organization, so that it's not as threatening. And sometimes it's the use of appropriate language that can help people understand that the reason that they're asking a question, the reason a person is asking a question is because they want to learn more. They're not trying to undermine. They're not trying to threaten. They're trying to learn more. They would like the group to learn more. And if that's the key, if that everybody can keep the eye on the prize in terms of this is about serving the learning, my sense is you'll be more open to the constructive conflict that can get you there. I'll give you a very specific example, and this is one that I have used in organizations to try to create that norm of openness. And it's as simple as this. If you, either at a group or at an individual conversation, if you feel that you're in conflict with somebody, the capacity to be able to look at them and just say, you and I are in conflict, and just leave it right there, is a key to success. Because if you've created norms in the organization that whenever someone looks at you and says, you and I are in conflict, your response should be, oh, wow, terrific. Tell me more. What's up? What's the issue? How can we resolve it? What are you thinking? But that idea of you and I are in conflict, and then seize upon that as an opportunity to learn together, you can create that norm in the organization. Your organization is going to become more of a learning organization and do much better across the board.
It was interesting because when you said that comment, Grant, my whole attitude kind of shifted, because it just put it on the table instead of having people sort of fighting for attention or fighting to get heard. If they just say, you and I have a conflicting view. And then the conversation it kind of tones the whole thing down.
Yeah. It normalizes it, and hopefully, not unlike the presence of an observer, just the very thought, puts everybody on their good behavior. Oh, we're in conflict. Okay, now let's figure this one out. And everybody pay attention. What are the skills? What are the techniques? How can we approach this in a way that's respectful of each other and get some great work done with each other? And frankly, it's one of my favorite lines. And I can tell you, I am cautious about working with people with whom I cannot be in conflict. And you might think that's an opposite to strong leadership, that a strong leader wants folks who can always achieve agreement and move forward together. But the trouble is, if they're achieving agreement because they don't want to be in conflict, that will come back to hurt you, I promise. It'll come back to hurt you because somebody's missed something, and now you're moving forward together in a compromised project. So I'm suspicious of folks who can't be in conflict with me, and the evidence of the contrary is when someone can say to me, you and I are in conflict, and I smile. I say, fantastic. Let's figure it out.
And that goes a long way toward building trust. That's another comment that's come up from our listeners is, how you develop a trusting enough relationship to have this kind of conflict. And it certainly comes from being, just speaking plainly that way.
I think that's right. And in fact, trust is always earned. You can walk in with a certain amount of it, but typically it's earned by behaviors. And not only are you watching others, but they're watching you. And some of the things that we've been talking about, are they open to disagreement? That creates then an environment where you can trust, that you can speak up. How do they respond when you do articulate your concern? Did they listen carefully, or did they patronize and then move on? In that moment of earning trust, it's behavioral, where you have that opportunity to experiment with techniques, very specific techniques, and hopefully then, as each is working well with those techniques and responding, you get to that next level of trust. And here's that next level of trust. Somebody does something that can be interpreted actually as unconstructive. They do something that looks like or could be interpreted as them trying to sabotage you or the project or otherwise, and you don't believe it because you just have a sense that you want to give that person the benefit of the doubt because there's enough trust there. And if necessary, you check in with them and say, at the last meeting you said this, and I can interpret that one of two ways, and I don't want to interpret it wrongly, so tell me more. What did you mean? That kind of trust and giving the benefit of the doubt gives you, and this is a key to organizations, that kind of trust earned over time gives you organizational slack. Organizational slack means that you have more room than you need. Think of it in terms of bandwidth, as we use a metaphor in technology. If you have more bandwidth than you need, then you can do more. And regretfully nowadays, organizations not only don't have slack, they have just the opposite. They have strained resources. Nobody has enough time to get done what they need to get done. And I'm suggesting that part of the solution is earn that trust with each other, so much so that you're giving the benefit of the doubt. You'll have slack. You'll give each other the room that's needed in order to create better together because you have room to do it. Mm-hmm. Now, it's not easy. It's easier said than done. Very difficult to accomplish that, but it is certainly not impossible, quite doable, but it doesn't happen naturally. You've got to work at it.
So let's take a little bit of a turn here. I'd like to hear what you feel are some unhealthy responses to conflict.
Well, I can do that. In fact, I think we have a slide on that that I can talk about my favorites, the top three, and how they get you into trouble.
All right.
And each one is different and has its own consequence. First of all, just being passive. And what I mean by that is not avoiding conflict. Avoiding conflict is a strategy. And if you're intentional in your approach to conflict, meaning that you're going to avoid it as a strategy, that's fine. I'm talking about being passive, meaning you don't do anything. You just receive whatever is occurring and work with it, let it go, and that's it. Now, that goes back to something I mentioned earlier in terms of that individual that knows that a project's compromised but is unwilling to speak up. They're being passive, and that's a problem because performance is not going to optimize. And I tell you what it does at the individual level. Keep doing that consistently in your professional life, and not only are you not going to optimize your professional opportunities. But it can have a health issue. It can turn into a health issue because the imagery there is a person who's a doormat, who just consistently is taking it and being passive, and that's not healthy. And so that's trouble not only at the individual level, it's trouble at the organizational level. The opposite of that is being aggressive. Now, aggressive is not being assertive, and I can talk about assertiveness, if you like, which is a constructive approach to conflict. Being aggressive, by definition, means you try to hurt the other person. Now, hopefully there's no physical interactions involved in this, but it doesn't have to be physical to hurt. In other words, by being aggressive, you're trying to shut them down. You are out-talking them. You are trying to deny what they are sharing. You're isolating them in an effort to be aggressive, to dominate, to get your way, what it comes down to. And that's not a healthy approach to conflict. It'll serve the purpose of shutting the person down. It'll serve the purpose of creating the norm for that group and that organization to don't speak up. Because if you speak up, the other person's going to get aggressive, and then there's consequences for that. That's not a healthy response to conflict. And then the third is my favorite, not because it's good, but because it is so nuanced, and that is the passive-aggressive behavior, passive-aggressive response. And I can tell you this probably hurts organizations the most because aggressive behavior is typically transparent. You can see it. Passive-aggressive behavior is hidden. Passive-aggressive behavior is when an individual is passive in the moment, doesn't say a thing, but instead of just letting it go and going along, they act aggressively away from the table, away from the meeting, away from the individual with whom they may be in conflict. And their behaviors away from that person are designed to denigrate. They're designed to hurt the other person. And so it's as simple as someone attending a meeting and there's a controversial issue. It is discussed openly at the meeting, but the person doesn't say a word for a whole host of reasons. And some of it may not be their fault that they don't feel comfortable saying something in the meeting. But then they leave the meeting and inside conversations begin to be critical. Critical of the project, critical of the person leading it, critical of others who are working on it, being aggressive in that moment. And the trouble with that is, since it's not transparent, it is very difficult to address. You'd have to have pretty good indicators in the organization that kind of passive-aggressive behavior is being engaged in, and then you have to try to get to the root of it, to the individual that's being aggressive away from the table. It's very difficult to deal with. I can tell you the solution, though, in an organization, and that is don't stand for it. So if any individual in any organization at any time begins to hear someone else acting passive-aggressively, in other words, they know the person didn't say anything to at the meeting or to the other person's face, but now they're beginning to talk in a negative fashion. If you hear that happening in your organization, you can just simply say, why don't you talk to Grant about that? I think he'd be open to hearing your ideas. Mm-hmm. Or these comments are better left to a more formal meeting. And what you're trying to do, and this goes back to an early question about etiquette and creating for your organization some protocols and norms that are going to be helpful. If you have that understanding in your organization, the passive-aggressive behavior is so 10 minutes ago. It's just not healthy, and it's just going to hurt us. And you create that norm, you're going to see that dissipate because the person engaging in passive-aggressive behavior will realize there's not a friendly audience for it. And they'll be the ones isolated, and that's a good thing. And hopefully, because I believe everybody can come around and be constructive, they learn how to be not passive-aggressive, but how to be assertive and how to take their very good ideas and bringing it to the fore instead of doing an end run.
Yeah, that was an excellent summation of those responses, really. My mind is sort of spinning because I've seen examples of all three. I'm sure all of us have. And it sounds to me like it really is something that needs to be infused over time into the culture, is that these are not the responses that we will tolerate because they're not helpful to what we're trying to accomplish as
Right?
a whole. So can
That's
we
right.
look at some general strategies for dealing with conflict?
Absolutely. And in fact, as we go there, let me talk about what you said in terms of creating that culture and how it's constructive, because I like to use this imagery when I'm helping organizations and individuals just work better together. And that is, who's robbing you of your life? Now, let me explain that, because the uh, conversation about strategies for dealing with conflict is going to help us understand how not to be taken advantage of. Because think about this. Everybody can do the math where they are. Who thought there'd be math on this exam, right? Math on this webinar. Think about how many hours, right? How many hours you're putting in at work on average uh, during any particular week, right? Um, Total number of hours, and then think to yourself, how many hours are not spent constructively because I'm dealing with issues that are not resolved properly, opportunities that are not addressed, in essence, conflict that's not constructive? What percentage of your time? Well, I'll tell you what. You take that percentage and multiply it by the number of hours you're working, and if you're doing a 50-hour work week and 20% of your time is being spent in unconstructive moments, then guess what? Somebody has robbed you of 10 hours of your time. And if you didn't spend those 10 hours at work, if you didn't have to spend those extra 10 hours at work, what would you do? Hopefully, you'd go home to family, friends, and loved ones and enjoy your life. So somebody's robbing you of your life, robbing you of your time. Why? Because we're not engaged in constructive opportunities, constructive approaches to conflict. Just want to make that point because when you talk about leadership in an organization, and particularly if we're trying to get rid of passive-aggressive behavior, I think the key is simply to say, you know what? We don't have time for this. Let's be creative. Let's be constructive. Let's address conflict. Let's get great work done, and then let's go home. That's fair. I think that's a healthy organization. Well, okay, that was a little bit of a segue getting on to our strategies for dealing with conflict. Here's the 5 of them. I'm going to give you just a brief summary of each one. Know that in the Essentials of Management program, we actually spend an entire session exploring these concepts and have a self-assessment instrument that folks can understand what their predisposition is. How are they approaching conflict right now, based upon self-assessment. Because if you know where you are and how you're generally approaching conflict, you know what else you have to do. You can add to your skills, and in fact, that's what we do in the Essentials of Management program, help people develop their skills to use any number of these strategies as well as other specific dispute resolution techniques. But let me just run down these 5, and each one really you can think of in terms of a focus on self or focus on other. When you're being competitive, you really are just trying to get your way. Now, I want to emphasize something here. Make a point that this is not being aggressive. Remember, the definition of aggressive is you're trying to hurt somebody. You're trying to shut them down. You can be very gracious and be very competitive. It simply means that you want to get your way, and it's either your way or the highway. And I'm going to tell you, there's a time and place for that. In the midst of all of this conversation about constructive conflict, there is absolutely a time and place for you to say, look, I'm right, and we're going to get this done. Steve Jobs is a great example in recent years of leadership that really had a conviction that there was a certain way to do it, and he made sure he got his way. And folks are benefiting from the products that were created as a part of that. Now, what is critical if you're going to take a competitive approach? You better be right, right? You don't want to overuse that technique. When you're right and you know it, there's a time to be competitive. If you don't know it, and it could be that somebody else has a better idea, it could be you want to stand down from being competitive. Let's go to the other end of the spectrum. Accommodating is when you let the other person have their way. 100%. And it can be a very strategic move. It could be because they are right. It could be because you don't know if they're right or wrong, but they have a greater expertise, and you're going to accommodate it. It could be that the issue's not that important to you, and so you let them have it, and you get something in the emotional bank in terms of they know that you're somebody they can work with, that you will permit them to have it their way, if you will. Now, let me emphasize, accommodating and the next one, avoiding, is not being passive. Remember, passive was just doing nothing. And that's not strategic. What we're talking about here is when you're accommodating, you're allowing the other person to have their way as a strategy. It's well thought out. You're being very intentional. And let me tie in then that idea of avoidance, because there is a time and place just to avoid conflict. Here we're talking about the art of conflict. You would think that if you follow these guidelines, you're going to be in conflict all the time. And the answer is no. That there is entirely appropriate times and places where you're going to just avoid the conflict. For example, something comes up at a meeting, and you know you're going to address it. You're not going to be passive, but it just would be inappropriate to bring it up at that time. It could be that there's not time enough at the meeting. It could be that it's too much of a public setting, that you're going to have to talk with a person away from the table and engage in a very constructive dialogue, just the two of you. Avoiding conflict should be a part of your repertoire, not because it's your only option, but because it's a strategic option. It's what you're going to do. And then there's some issues that are never going to get resolved. In our language, in contemporary speak, folks say, don't go there. And you know what they're signaling? Yeah, you know what they're signaling? Let's just not go there. We've been through this. Nothing's changed. Don't have a hope that we can somehow come up with a better solution, which we'll talk about in terms of engaging in compromise or trying to collaborate. It's just not going to work. So you know what? Let's keep the peace. Let's resolve the conflict by simply not going there. That's healthy. That's a good thing. Well, if you have a sense that you can't avoid it forever and you do have to move forward, and it's not just about getting your way or letting the other person have their way, you can engage in some compromise. And compromise, by definition, is they get something and you get something. Oftentimes, it's a math problem. Again, you take the total and you divide by 2. If there's 2 people in conflict, then you're going to split it 50-50. It doesn't have to be an even split, but that oftentimes is the way it works out. Compromising can be very expedient when you don't have a lot of time to explore details, and you want to make sure that each person walks away with something. Taking a compromise approach permits you to say, all right, you go ahead, take this one, I get that one, and we'll work together again because we're able to both walk away with value. That's very constructive. The challenge is some people think that's the essence of negotiation, that it's only about compromise, that you just always just split it, and that's good negotiation. Now, it can be necessary for all the reasons I just described, but it's not finding the fullness. And collaborating, taking a collaborative approach to conflict where you're really listening carefully to what the other person needs, what their interests are. And hopefully they're doing the same for you, and you're articulating not just what your positions are, not your your negotiating positions and the stands that you're taking, but rather articulating exactly what's important to you in the project or on that particular issue. They're listening, you're listening, and then you come up with some creative solutions where you both can get what you need. And that's a true collaborative approach. And whenever you're able to achieve it, doesn't happen all the time. It is dependent on your skills if you have the ability to do it. But whenever you can take a collaborative approach and you achieve that solution where everybody walks away with the fullness of what they need, then you're on to great performance, great success. That's it in a nutshell in terms of 5 different strategies. Each of us have a predisposition towards it. That doesn't mean that we're stuck there, because once you know what your inclination is, you can then begin to expand your repertoire. The ideas, as I've described very briefly, each one of these have a value. And if you're able to use each one in an appropriate way, likely you're going to become a very effective person at handling conflict in your organization, and in that take your organization to next level performance.
Thank you, Grant. I have a couple more things that I want us to chat about. I'm going to give a little preview. One is one that you and I spoke about briefly yesterday, and someone asked about a bullying sort of culture. But somebody's asked a question about what the difference is between compromise and collaborate. If you could give an example of that, they are seeming a little similar.
Right. And the difference is that you don't get fully, in a compromise, you don't get fully what you needed. You had to let something go. I'm going to give you an elemental example. It's used in the dispute resolution, conflict resolution literature, and it makes the case about individuals who are arguing about an orange, and they both want it. And the compromise approach to that is to cut it in half, and everybody gets something. Each person gets half the orange, only to find out that one person peeled the orange and ate the meat of it, as most of us would do, while the other person took the rind of the orange and used it in a recipe. They actually both wanted different things in that orange. But because they quickly went to a compromise, cut it in half, both of them got only part of what they needed, when in fact they could have had the fullness of what they needed. Now that's just by way of illustration in terms of the difference between a compromise where you are cutting it in half or whatever the number is and you didn't get all that you needed. The challenge in unlocking the puzzle in issues that go beyond just the simplicity of a piece of fruit is to understand what people's fundamental interests are, right? What is the thing that is driving the person to want that particular solution? And they may be staking out a position. This is key. They may be staking out a position saying, no, we have to get this done by Friday. And that's my bottom line. We got to have it done by Friday. And the other person saying, we have to have another week, right? Well, if you just compromised on that, your solution would be Tuesday. Mm-hmm. But if you understand what the person's concern was, that why they needed it on Friday, this Friday, and what the other person's concern was, why they needed an additional week, and you talked about it fully, and it has to do with trust. Sometimes people don't want to say. But if you can share information and understand what each needs, it's possible that it's not even a matter of Tuesday. It's a matter of some things are done on Friday, some things are done a week later, or maybe the whole thing is just done a month later. Because you suddenly realize that you can meet people's needs without meeting their position. That's the essence of collaboration. Compromise takes everything pretty much at face value and then just divvies it up. Collaboration is about understanding fundamental needs and coming up with solutions that are a part of the project, right? You may have to expand some resources, but they're doable. And then in that process, everybody gets what they need. That's the fullness of a collaborative approach.
Very good. Thank you for explaining that. I'd like to address one kind of big topic before we need to close this webinar, and that's bullying. And a couple of people who have been in the chat have noted that some of the behavior that you spoke about earlier, both passive, aggressive, and then the third, passive aggressive, seems to contribute to a sort of bullying type of culture that obviously leads to both overt and covert conflict. So would you mind talking about that for a little bit?
I would be happy to, and I'll say, unfortunately, that in the contemporary context, I think we're seeing more behavior in organizations that can be labeled bullying behavior. I'm not sure that we're seeing more of it or just we're more open to talking about it. And if it's the latter, then that's actually a good thing. There's actually new research being done, a whole school of thought that's focusing on civility in organizations and what does acting civil with each other mean. And I think that's very constructive. That's going to be a productive avenue of inquiry. And so let me talk a little bit about how to find wisdom in this whole idea of bullying. The first is understanding what it is and what it isn't. And so the examples that the person writing in called upon, the aggressive behavior, passive-aggressive behavior, that definitely is either bordering on or can be considered bullying behavior. right? Because you're trying to shut the other person down, and that's problematic. What you want to be mindful of is whether it's born of the person's style or their underlying strategy. And what I mean by that is sometimes um, individuals have a particular communication style that seems to be aggressive. Somebody else may interpret their way of communicating as being aggressive. And they're not necessarily trying to be aggressive or even trying to bully. They just have a communication style that sometimes is very direct, more tell than ask, loud. And the first thing you want to do is figure out, is this person really trying to bully me, right? Trying to impose their will on me, shut me down, or are they just communicating in a way that I'm not comfortable with? And even if it's the latter, they're communicating in a way that you're not comfortable with, doesn't mean you have to take it. Doesn't mean that you're not going to say anything, but you're going to address it in the right way, meaning that you're going to have an open conversation about communication styles with the hope, and if the person who is engaged in that kind of behavior is open to it, that they can actually self-manage a bit and not engage in a communication style that is off-putting to others. So I think in all of this, we want to be mindful of people are different. People have different communication styles. But once you get onto the idea that somebody is bullying, meaning that they are using their communication style or anything else as a way of imposing their will, it needs to be made transparent. And what I mean by that is both at the organizational level, there has to be norms about what's acceptable and what's not acceptable. And just like I talked about an organization not accepting passive-aggressive behavior, there has to be a norm in the organization that says, this is just unacceptable. We don't bully people here. We don't impose our will on people unnecessarily in an effort to denigrate them. So there has to be a transparency in terms of the norms. If that's not the case, then it's much more difficult to combat it in an organization because the particular behavior might be perceived as normal or something that's welcomed, right? You can have organizations with cultures that actually thrive on that kind of aggressive behavior. If, though, you're developing an organization where you don't want folks to be bullied, you have transparency about the norm and then transparency in the actual activity. There's plenty of research that goes well beyond management theory that talks about bullies rarely stop themselves. And in fact, if anything, they feed on the power that they get from imposing their will on others. And what that means is they have to be confronted. And the research also shows that more often than not, when they are confronted, they fold rather quickly. And that's because they have nothing to stand on other than their overt use of power to dominate. They don't have the substance. And when they're confronted on the bullying behavior, they quickly begin to backpedal. Now, that doesn't mean they're not going to try to get even, right? You got to be careful, right? I didn't say it was easy, and there are risks. But you know what? All the things we've talked about so far, those norms, those etiquettes, the transparency, a culture that says we work well together here even in the midst of heated conflict, but we don't bully. And you can only hope that if the person has actually arrived at that moment of bullying behavior in spite of themselves, that they are reachable and teachable too, and they can be corrected whether it's a style issue or something that they're doing that it doesn't make them a good fit in the organization. They always have the opportunity to change, and you hope you can reach them. First, isolate, identify, try to reach them so that they can be more constructive in what they do, because all of us have grown up in different times and places with different expectations of conflict, and when we meet together in the public square, which corporations now are, organizations now are, the public square, we got to figure it out together. And some behaviors that we've learned are just not acceptable in the public square, and we have that opportunity to change. That's actually quite constructive. And if not, then the organization has to step in to make sure that those behaviors don't continue because they're counterproductive. They're not going to maximize performance. What we always talk about, every topic we covered in Essentials of Management is always about performance. How is any of this going to help you do better as an individual? How is it going to help your organization do better in its mission?
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Grant. As we close, what final words of advice do you have for folks in terms of learning to engage in constructive conflict?
I'm going to give you the one item that we have talked about generally, but I'm going to give you this encouragement, particularly if you want to be effective without necessarily calling attention to yourself. And I make this promise in our programs. It's a guarantee. If you do this, what I'm about to describe, if you do this and you do it well, you're going to become a very powerful person in a very constructive way. And it's something that is simple to do, but it is a technique. And regretfully, the reason that I have done this build-up is because what I'm about to tell you, everybody's going to say, oh, yeah, of course. But I'm here to tell you, it's a technique that is so difficult that if I put you into a boot camp for a day to teach you this technique, at the end of the day, you'd be exhausted. And I think we would have changed your behaviors to get you to that next level. And what I'm talking about is the concept of listening. And I'm not just talking about listening where your eyes glaze over and you wait for the person to be done so that you can start talking. I'm talking about active listening. It is a technique. It is a capacity to engage with another person. So not only do you hear what they're saying, but they know that you've heard what they've said. And that actually is the secret to your success, what's going to make you powerful, because you're going to get a reputation that you're a great listener, that when folks engage with you, they really feel heard. You don't always get your way. What you're saying is not always embraced, but you feel heard. And a leader who has that capacity to actively listen and to engage with folks not only is going to become powerful because people are going to want to talk with them, but you also may say, well, that's a downside. I'll now have to spend all my days just listening to people, and I won't get my own work done. And I can tell you that if you learn the skills of active listening, you can shorten your conversations. Because literally, as you are drawing out from them what they're trying to say, and some people, they themselves don't know how to say it, but if you have that capacity to draw out from them what they're trying to say, you're going to have shorter conversations, you're going to have shorter meetings, they're going to be more meaningful and more productive, all of that because you made a commitment to develop and hone your skills on this idea of active listening. I promise you do that, and you're going to have a whole different life from there on in your organization.
That's wonderful. I mean, it kind of, in a way, makes it's a way to expedite conflict, if you will, to sort of speed up the process and make sure that everyone gets heard.
Mm-hmm.
Really heard.
And what I love about it is that you're managing the process to the end that you describe, speeding up the conflict, making sure everybody had heard, and yet you're doing it in such a way that is so honoring to other people. Mm-hmm. That's the key.
Excellent. Well, this has been a really enlightening conversation for me. I hope it has been for the people who've joined us. I want to thank you, first of all, Professor Ackerman, for being here and for sharing your expertise and insights on the art of conflict. And I want to thank everyone who joined us for submitting such wonderful questions and comments. We tried to cover as many as we could, so thank you for your participation. We will be sending out a recording of this webinar, so if you came in late or you had to leave early, you'll be able to enjoy the whole thing again. And I think I'm going to listen to it again, Grant. There was just a lot in there, so I really, really appreciate that. And I want to make sure and reiterate that Professor Ackerman is the Faculty Director of Columbia Essentials of Management, and the next session of that begins on June 7th. He does cover the art of managing conflict as well as many other areas related to business and leadership. So thank you so much, Grant. And if you have any questions about the programs, please feel free to visit our website at gsb.columbia.edu/execed.
Thank you, Mary. It was my delight. Always a pleasure to work with you.
Thanks, Grant. We'll talk to you all soon.